As you can well imagine, I must start with the extraordinary decision of the Constitutional Court in Uganda overturning the anti-homosexuality bill. Admittedly, it was a procedural decision. Apparently there wasn't a quorum in Parliament when the bill was passed, but the bill is now null and void, and that is a wonderful achievement. Now, mind you, you can see President Museveni's fine hand in all of this. He's been hurting financially as a result of a number of donor countries withholding funds because of their opposition to the anti-gay bill. And President Museveni wants to restore a smidgen of personal credibility on the eve of an African Union summit, which will be attended by President Obama. But on the other hand, we mustn't get carried away. There is still anti-gay legislation in Uganda. One doesn't know what will happen now to the LGBT community, or whether there'll be some kind of violent backlash as a result of the judicial decision. You know, it's impossible for me to convey the craziness, the fascist thuggery, the barbarism of the extreme religious right in Uganda. I'd like to pack them all off to solitary confinement for the next 30 or 40 years in the hope that in the interim we can provide equal rights and human rights in that country. On the other hand, all of that notwithstanding, it's wonderful when the courts overrule Parliament. It's happening with regularity now in Canada and the United States. Why not Uganda? Allow me then to digress and move to a second point, which refers to something I mentioned last week, where the Global Burden of Disease study, a very eminent study that was published in The Lancet, differed significantly in its figures around estimates of HIV and AIDS, differed with UNAIDS. The Global Burden of Disease suggested that there were several 100,000 fewer infections each year, several 100,000 fewer deaths, that's really important, each year than UNAIDS was estimating. But most important, the Global Burden of Disease study suggested that there were 29 million people living with the virus, not 35 million, as has been stated by UNAIDS. A difference of 6 million is no small matter. That you don't need to have Socratic wisdom to understand that it has real implications for future planning against the pandemic. So there was no answer right away from UNAIDS, and we wondered why. Well, the answer then came out. There was a letter signed by the head of UNAIDS, the head of the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, the head of PEPFAR, the presidential initiative in the United States, and they responded to the Global Burden of Disease study. Again, you can't imagine a more milquetoast, namby-pamby, insubstantial, irrelevant, packing all the rhetorical power of a piece of Kleenex. You can't imagine how inconsequential the response was. They said, well, the Global Burden of Disease study says we're making progress. Yes, we are. And it says there's more to do. Yes, there is. But no way did they confront the mathematical differences, the statistical differences. They just can't be transparent. They cannot take it on directly. Now, I understand that from the head of UNAIDS and the head of the Global Fund. They are spin doctors extraordinaire. But I was very disappointed that the head of PEPFAR, the new head of PEPFAR, joined that little coterie of illusionists. And the final rather sad point to make in this commentary is that we're now more than 100 days beyond the abduction of those girls in Nigeria. In the interim, the international community has dealt with Iraq and Afghanistan, with Syria and Libya, with Ukraine and now the Middle East, but not with the girls of Nigeria. It's the stuff of nightmares to imagine what has happened to them or what is happening to them. That was last week. I'm Stephen Lewis.